zoned residential, and it should be preserved as this gem. And there are unlimited resources in space that we can go, mine and use, but we should preserve Earth because of limited resources and a growing population, growing energy needs. And in high school, Jeff gave a similar speech, although he said at the time Earth should be preserved as a national park. So it's been sort of remarkably consistent through all that. Even before he had founded Amazon, he went to an auction at Sotheby's, and they were selling off former Soviet artifacts from space. And he bid on a couple of items and lost. He wasn't yet a billionaire, but he had always had that interest.
Yeah. And, how did he come to end up founding Blue Origin? How did that come about?
So he had this long interest in space that persevered also through college and at Princeton. And he was with Neil Stephenson, the science fiction author who wrote the book Seven Eves and many others. And they were seeing the Homer Hickam movie, October Sky. And they had, after the movie, were having coffee. And there's an interesting side note, when I was asking, Neil Stephenson told me the story, and then I went back and asked Jeff about it and what he remembered, and he remembered it very vividly to the point where he remembered that he snuck in peanut butter sandwiches into the theater for them to eat while they were watching the movie.
And he was already like Amazon billionaire by that point.
This was 99, so they could have afforded the popcorn.
Yeah.
Pricey as it is at those theaters, even the extra large.
Yeah.
And so they were having coffee afterwards, and Jeff said to him, I've always wanted to start a space company. It's something I always wanted to do. And Neil Stephenson said to him, well, do it. Just do it. And so he did. And, at first it wasn't really much of a company. It was more of sort of like a research and development, ideas shop. And they were in this warehouse in Seattle. And the idea at the very beginning, and they spent 2 years, Neil Stephenson, a couple other people, and Jeff would check in periodically. I think even then on Wednesdays, he reserves Wednesdays for space. That's when he goes, when he's in Seattle, to go to Blue Origin. Think of different ways to get to space. Does it have to be a traditional chemically fueled rocket? Is there any other way to get up to space? I mean, they were sort of starting from ground zero. Is there a better way to do this? So they came up with some, when I was sitting with Jeff, he was like, you're going to want to hear the wild ideas. And I said, yeah, I want to hear the crazy ones. And I'll share one just quickly. He said, well, do you know how a bullwhip works? And he said, that sound, the crack is, part of sonic boom. Well, how do you create a sonic boom with just your arm? And that momentum is mass times velocity. The mass of the whip gets smaller at the end, so the velocity increases. So I was like, you were going to use a bullwhip to shoot people to get to space? So, well, not people, but maybe it could have been an idea. Yeah. So there were ideas like that they looked at, and ultimately decided that the best way to get to space is a traditional chemically fueled rocket, but it had to be reusable. Yeah. And you had to land it. So they had that idea early on, just as Elon did.
Well, and so then compare that to Elon Musk and kind of his story, his childhood, going from South Africa to, I guess, Canada and then to the U.S. and how he ended up founding a rocket company.
Right, and the story there is fairly well documented. He came from a place where he had sold PayPal to eBay and started thinking about what's next, in his life. Where could he have the most impact for humanity? And space was one of those areas that he wanted to look at. And so he was driving back, I think, in New York or from Long Island with a friend of his, and they started talking about this and thinking about this. And he's been focused, really on Mars. And the idea is like, well, where are we in terms of getting to Mars? Like, what's going on with that? We were landed on the moon in 1969. Mars seems like a natural next step. Where is that going? He goes on to NASA's website, starts searching around for that, and doesn't see the Mars plan. And he's like, well, why aren't we advancing in space? This idea, and I think this sort of pervades all of these entrepreneurs who are very innovative and move very fast and have had great success doing that, and look at the space program, the human space program, and said we went to the moon in 1969, which was 250,000 miles away, and now we go to the International Space Station, an amazing engineered object, but that's 250 miles away. Why haven't we, I think Elon said this last year in Australia, it's 2017, we should have bases on the moon by now. So I think he wanted to see the rate of progress improve, and not to put the onus on NASA, which has had sort of a limited budget and different administrations and political wells pulling it this way or that, but it's been dominated by some heavy hitter companies and contractors, and he thought that was an industry that was ripe for disruption, and I think he was right. I mean, he's showing that was an industry that could be changed, and SpaceX has had an enormous effect.
Yeah. Now, the stories of Richard Branson and Paul Allen, they're really intertwined, right? So can you talk a little bit about that? And as Elon Musk is risk-loving, Paul Allen is not.
Right. Well, so where Paul Allen got involved, I mean, now this is going back to 2004 in the Ansari X Prize, which was a seminal moment, and one that folks in the space community remember. But I'm sort of surprised at how many people sort of have forgotten that, given that at the time it got an enormous amount of attention. This was the first privately backed non-governmental vehicle that made it to space, and they did it 3 times, and some real white knuckle harrowing rides, but they did it and did it successfully, and it's Spaceship One hangs in the Air and Space Museum next to the Spirit of St. Louis, but to talk about Paul Allen, he went through that, and it kind of, I think, freaked him out, frankly. I mean, those rides were really harrowing, and if somebody died during that, which is always a real possibility in spaceflight, it really kind of scared him and set him back. And the other thing, and he partnered eventually at the end with Richard Branson, who acquired the rights to the technology and now is pursuing Spaceship Two to do sort of this and to really grow it and to make it commercially viable. But what's interesting about that moment too is everyone kind of thought that this is it, we've done it. We've gone to space. We did it without the government. And now that's this watershed moment, and we're off to the races, and it's a new era in space, and it didn't happen. Not then, and for a lot of reasons, but it shows just how difficult all of this is.
It kind of stalled for a while.
Yeah.
I mean, the X Prize I remember well, because when I was my senior year of college, our design project for our class was to come up with a design that could win the X Prize.
Interesting. Well, here's an interesting figure that I think about a lot and have in the book. You had the Wright brothers do their first flight in 1903. By 1955, there were more people in the United States flying commercial airlines than were taking the railroad, right? That's where that tipping point came 52 years later. Now, I think it's not a perfect comparison, commercial airlines to space, although I think, a lot of reporters, including me, do that. But it sort of shows you how more difficult this road has been. And we're not there yet, but, these companies certainly are making a lot of progress.
And they're talking about things like suborbital travel.
Yeah.
Get you around the world in, 40, 50 minutes.
Right, and that's another goal of Richard Branson's and Virgin Galactic, and it's possible this year we could have, or next, Virgin or Blue Origin flying tourists, up to the edge of space. Blue Origin wants to do that on a rocket. Virgin Galactic would do it on the air-launched Spaceship Two, but that idea that, ordinary people, I mean, at first, maybe not ordinary if you can afford to pay $250,000 to do it, but that if they're successful with that, and they do it repeatedly and reliably and efficiently, and the price comes down, and it is like a real thing that happens, and not, who knows, there are a lot of challenges to making that happen, that just to think that you might know someone who's been to space, or someone who knows someone who's been to space and can talk about that, and you're at a dinner party, says, oh yeah, Paul did one of those, and all of a sudden he's talking about, doing cartwheels in a spacecraft and seeing the curvature of the Earth. I mean, that would have a profound effect, right, on society, I think.
Yeah. All right, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. I'm sure we have a lot of people here who want to ask questions. So we're going to do it the old-fashioned way. Just raise your hand. See a question over here. We've got microphones, so wait a second, and we'll bring around the microphone to you. We'll go over on this side first.
Hi. So I'm curious, how should NASA adapt to better facilitate progress in the private sector, or in both cooperating with the private sector and in facilitating innovation within?
That's a great question. I think we've seen that happen, and that's been going on for some time, and it's only growing. I mean, it really started, to some degree under the Bush administration with the contracts to fly cargo to the International Space Station. That was awarded to SpaceX and then Orbital Sciences, now Orbital ATK. At the time there was some discussion about maybe they should fly crew too, but under Mike Griffin at NASA at the time, they decided to stay just with cargo, but it was a success, and they've been doing that now for several years. And then the Obama administration came in and said, you know what, we'll turn crews over to, now it's SpaceX and Boeing, who are, the schedule is that they would start flying crew this year in test flights. Looks like that may get pushed, but we don't know that yet. And the idea is that would allow NASA to focus on going to deep space, that they would turn low Earth orbit over to the commercial sector, to the private sector. But now, and under the Trump administration, you're seeing a lot more talk about continuing that, but continuing that public-private partnership and going into deep space. And so you've had Blue Origin, for example, pitch NASA on building a lunar lander. And you hear a lot of talk about the Deep Space Gateway, or whatever it's called now. But the Trump administration has talked about building on what had happened in Bush and Obama, and really sort of partnering with the private sector and leveraging that. Now that the industry is sort of is growing and has become more robust and has shown that it can be relied upon to perform these missions.
Yeah, we just had a SpaceX cargo mission go up this week.
Right, it's like it's
routine.
And Elon said it's and not just that it's routine, but even the landings are routine.
Yeah.
And that's what we don't. I used to cover all of those, and now they're not even news anymore.
Right. Up front here.
Hi, I'm Netra Halpern, Peace Films. I'm noticing from the title, the quest to colonize the cosmos. I was thinking it was going to be kind of more, you had a political bent, but I'm also wondering, there's two ways that it could go. One, there could be competition, and that could be it could be a point of international fighting, or it could be a point where countries started seeing like, oh, we are Earthlings together, and like how the United States, the colonies aren't fighting with each other; they're America. We could this could help bring the world together, and have people stop fighting and seeing ourselves as one species.
Well, I think that when astronauts go to space, you hear them talk about the overview effect and seeing Earth from a distance, right? That whole notion that we're in space. Earth is in space, spaceship Earth, and that you see countries, not like on a map with, borders on them, and there is that sort of profound effect. But I think that all these companies, when they want to go to space and extend humanity into space, I think they see that as sort of for the collective good. Whether it's Elon's idea that we should be on Mars, because in case something happens to Earth, we need sort of a plan B, or it's Jeff Bezos' idea that he just wants millions of people living and working in space, right? This the O'Neillian idea of just having humanity spread out into the cosmos more generally.
Yeah. Okay, in the back here.
I was just wondering if you could speak to how what happened with Virgin Galactic, if that impacted the way that other people are conducting their research, or what the impact of the tragedy that happened with Virgin Galactic had.
Yeah, it was a real interesting moment, and the industry as a whole now sort of there's a commercial spaceflight industry. Even before that, they were looking early on and saying, look, we're pushing frontiers here, and space is hard and it's risky, and if somebody dies, if there's a fatality, that's a real possibility. And they were very concerned then, as I'm sure they are now, that there would be this regulation that comes in and just sort of kills the industry, right? And their point would say, we're going to be as safe as possible and try to be efficient. I mean, as a business plan, it's generally not a good idea to kill your customers, right? But these people sign up to do this, and I think they kind of look at it the way people might climb Mount Everest. Right? If you can afford to do it, it's dangerous. It's hard. In fact, you're stepping over bodies as you're going up, and what you're getting into. And so there is the standard that governs it. It's an informed consent standard that you sign on the dotted line. This is hard. So then we had that moment where this was tested with the fatal accident, and was it a moment that was going to kill Virgin Galactic? Would that put them out of business? And I talked to Richard Branson about it, and I've talked to George Whitesides, the CEO of Virgin Galactic, and they've talked about it publicly, and they sort of huddled and decided to press on and continue with it. That they felt, confident that they could fix the problem, that they could fly safely, that they had people depending on them, and that it was worth it to keep going on if they're able to achieve that. So, was it a setback? Absolutely. But it seems as if they've sort of overcome it. Now, we'll see what happens as SpaceX and Boeing and Blue Origin start flying humans. If there are multiple fatal accidents, that could be a real cause for concern. And I think it's one that NASA, as they look toward the commercial crew program, as they look toward flying astronauts for the first time, that's something they're going to take very seriously.
Let's go up here in the front.
When you compare the financial structure of these companies, where most of the finances come from which investors? Is it some of them government subsidized, some of them maybe what kind of investors or?
Well, Blue Origin has Jeff Bezos. For the most part, it's self-financed. He said somewhat jokingly a year ago that every year he sells $1 billion of Amazon stock and invests it into Blue Origin. SpaceX was started with Elon Musk invested $100 million into SpaceX and had 3 launches that failed to get to orbit on the 4th one. And at that moment, if that 4th launch wasn't successful, he said they would have been out of business. But the 4th launch was successful, and now they put a 4-leaf clover on every mission patch, which they did on that 4th launch, and have worked very closely with NASA to get NASA development contracts that help them build the Falcon 9. SpaceX invested a lot of their own money into that, and then since then they've won contracts worth billions of dollars to fly cargo and eventually crew, and are now competing for very lucrative national security launches from the Pentagon to launch national security satellites to space. And not to mention, they have commercial customers, and they received, I did a story a while back on Steve Jurvetson, one of the Silicon Valley venture capitalists, who was an early backer of SpaceX. And he had wanted to get into a next round of funding for SpaceX. And even though he was early into the company, they sort of said, you know what, Steve, can you kind of hold off, because we've got so much demand coming in on this. And there was a report recently put out by Bryce Space and Technology, sort of a consulting firm in Virginia, that has tracked the venture capital investment, not just into these big name companies, but to the industry in general. And I think really, SpaceX has demonstrated that you can have a successful company into it. So for me, the sort of key is the money going to follow it. And so far, it seems like it's starting to flow in.
And Blue Origin, self-financed for now, but they've started signing up customers for their orbital rocket, which hasn't launched yet.
Right.
Right.
Yep. They've got they are starting to sign up customers. They have indicated they want to compete for some of those national security launches, so that would put them in competition with SpaceX and the United Launch Alliance, the Lockheed and Boeing, and so they're starting to get into the game too. Now, 18 years later, they may have some actual revenue.
Do you think that these companies want to go after SLS, the Space Launch System that NASA's been developing for the ultra-heavy lift missions to go to the moon and Mars? Do you think Blue Origin and SpaceX want to go for that? Make a run at it?
I think publicly they're not going to challenge NASA's rocket at a moment when they're trying to do business with NASA. But you talk to industry officials and you look at SpaceX, for example, their next generation rocket after the Falcon Heavy, they call it the BFR, the Big Falcon rocket. If they're able to do that, that seems like a real challenge. And Blue Origin has said they've got their New Glenn rocket. Jeff Bezos has said that would be the smallest orbital rocket they would ever build, and they're already thinking about their next one, which would be called the New Armstrong, which might give you a sense of where that's headed. But can they all exist together? Is it a zero-sum game? I mean, I think there's also an argument to be made, that they could. But if you look at the costs of SLS, I think NASA has said it's $1 billion a launch for that rocket.
Yeah.
So that could be a concern with how the economics play out, but it's got capabilities that right now is unmatched.
Right. Okay, here on the aisle.
Sure. I'm Feng Qing with the China Daily, and I have two questions. First one is in terms of your communication and conversation with those billionaire entrepreneurs, and where are they now in terms of the hardship and also the success? And the second question is, in terms of your conversation, and do you think that the eventual success will outperform the huge investment they put into? Thank you.
I'm not quite sure I followed. I mean, I think their success, where they are now in terms of what they've accomplished?
Yeah.
Well, I think, the real big test that's coming up for, Virgin Galactic, Blue Origin, and SpaceX, and we look at all of the things they've done, particularly SpaceX has achieved, more than a lot of people thought was ever possible. And we saw this amazing, Falcon Heavy launch and the 2 boosters that landed and Tesla and the mannequin named Starman floating through space. They haven't actually flown a human being yet. Neither has Blue Origin to space. And so that is a huge test. You fly satellites, even, very exquisite, expensive, sensitive government satellites, for the intelligence community. But there's nothing quite like it when there's a human being on top of the rocket. And so that's where we are right now. That seems to me the first big next step, and that's coming, and that could be coming this year. So that's going to be a huge challenge for all of them.
You had a question up front here. We'll wait for the microphone.
Yeah, I was wondering if Jeff elaborated on why they've remained so secret. Why haven't they taken a note out of Virgin's playbook and started signing people up already?
That's a great question. We push and try to get them to open up, and they are now. What they say is, we want to talk about stuff after we've done it. When we've accomplished something, then we'll do it. And Jeff said something about in space particularly, the ratio to hype and attention you get for words as opposed to actions is sort of out of proportion. And he much prefers to sort of talk about it after it's done. As a journalist, I would like a little bit more insight into that and even more timeliness on when they talk about things. I mean, there'll be something, the first launch of New Shepard, we didn't find out about it until 24 hours later. And there are a lot of journalists who've done really good work in pushing them. And they had a test go awry several years ago, and I sort of document this in the book, and NASA started getting phone calls because people in West Texas knew that there was Blue Origin had a launch site, and finally the NASA public affairs officer had to call Blue Origin's public affairs officer, said, you got to say something about this, you just blew up a rocket, and so they did, kind of put out a statement about it. But I think they want to be very careful, and it's just sort of the difference in their culture between Blue Origin and SpaceX, that they're just so secretive and so quiet, and they're not going to talk about it until they've done it. Right.
Well, so related question to that is, have you been able to notice a difference in how these companies approach Washington and politics and Congress and lobbying?
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So SpaceX really led the way on this. And I sort of say there are three things, and sort of a fourth leg to the SpaceX stool, right? One is, and the first is, Elon Musk came in and just kind of took Washington by storm. And I was talking earlier about that lawsuit, I think it was in 2014, but he had filed the lawsuits going after those national security launches as early as 2005, 3 years before they ever successfully got to orbit. So he had a very aggressive campaign in Washington. And one of the stories in the book is, leading up to, one of these lawsuits is, he's thinking, should we sue the Air Force over the right to try to compete against the United Launch Alliance? We'd be suing, the customer. There's a huge downside. And they had a conversation with Elon. He was in Washington. He was sitting in the back of a car, and they said, he did this very weird thing that apparently Elon does. He just closed his eyes and went quiet for like minutes on end, like thinking this through. It's like a decision tree about what should I do, and if I sue, what are the pros and cons, and ultimately decided to file the lawsuit. But you marry that with the enormous sort of almost like celebrity appeal that he has and the following that he has on social media, and let's face it, like a fan base. He's in some ways, I don't want to overstate it, but a sort of Neil Armstrongian figure for a new generation of space, whether that's earned or not. That he does have this appeal. But you can do all of that, but if you don't have the technical capability, if you don't back it up with the rockets, then it's meaningless. And so he has been able to back it up and fly successfully. Now they've had setbacks and some significant ones, but they've shown that they could bounce back from that. So.
Well, and that aggressiveness carries through into the engineering work. And there's one story that you relate in the book about where they're having a problem with a rocket nozzle. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, and this I think is like quintessential SpaceX. I mean, Gwen Shotwell, the president of SpaceX, what she said to me, it became sort of a mantra for SpaceX throughout the book was, we're SpaceX, we're head down, plow through the line. And so the story was, I think it was one of the early flights of their Falcon 9 rocket, and the day before launch, they detected a crack in the engine nozzle, sort of the skirt that goes around the engine of the second stage engine. And, like normally you'd say, well, let's pull the rocket down, take it apart, inspect the engine. Maybe we've got to look at our manufacturing processes. How did this happen? You're talking about months of delays. And instead, Elon gathers his team around him and says, like, what if we just cut around the crack? Like if you have a crack on your fingernail and you just clip it off and your fingernail's not as long, but it's not cracked. And they were like, okay, and everyone's scrambling to do the math, and because it's a second stage engine, not the booster, maybe it would be okay. And they did the calculation. They had built margin into it, and everyone said, okay, boss, checks out. And they went around the room, and Elon polled everyone, and everyone said it was okay. So that night, they fly a guy from Hawthorne, California, their headquarters, to the Florida Space Coast with like essentially like a pair of like almost garden shears, and he cuts around the engine, and they flew like without wasting 5 minutes.
And it worked.
And it worked. And it worked. Now, again, that's in a development program, right? They're a much more mature, bigger company now, that's responsible for, going to be flying astronauts. You do that with an astronaut on board? I don't think so. But it sort of shows that's that sort of hard charging mentality.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the very back here. You have a question?
Hello, my name is Iskander. I'm coming from Kazakhstan, but at the same time, I'm Rumsfeld Fellow at the DC. You mentioned about the billionaires, and specifically that most of them are coming from US. If you take into account that China is rising in terms of the AI and the space industry at the same time, can you expect that there will be a competition among the billionaires from the US and China for colonizing, so-called, the cosmos in the future?
I think so. I think obviously China's made a lot of strides. I know it's something that people in Congress are watching, people at NASA, people in the Pentagon, and certainly these companies are watching that as well, because to this day they're still sort of driven in large part by where the U.S. federal government is going. If there is another space race, and to some degree I think there's one sort of beginning, that would help fuel it. And in some ways, from the civilian side anyway, that could be a good thing, right? I mean, the United States got to the moon because it was in a Cold War space race with the Soviet Union. And NASA got all of this money. It's kind of like an adjunct to the Pentagon that got the United States to the moon because they were in that kind of a rivalry. So I think competition is really, I have a line in the book, this refers to the competition between the companies in the billionaires, but rivalry is sort of the best rocket fuel.
Other questions? Let's go over here.
So this is kind of going back to the earlier question. So at the beginning, you mentioned that the thing that is in common for all four of these billionaires is that their interest in really democratizing space and in increasing the access to space. But I also think about, historically, when rich white guys and colonization go hand in hand, it in some ways has led to progress in some arenas, but it also at fairly large both human and environmental cost. And so I'm wondering given your experience working with these four folks and studying them, what do you think they have or have not learned from history, or how do you feel like their philosophy and this idea of colonizing space and making use of resources, how do you feel like that plays into their philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, like how that ultimately plays out, and it makes a lot of assumptions, right, that this is going to happen, and when we're out there, how do we govern ourselves in Mars? What are the rules? Who gets to go? Who's in charge? I think, for now, what they're focused on is getting there and building the transportation network to take us there, right? Like pushing west, with the railroad. And you've got to sort of lay the tracks to be able to get out to California before you sort of set up the government. So it's again an imperfect analogy because we're talking years and years, if not decades into the future before some of the scenarios that you're talking about. But it's a really interesting point, and one that certainly, as they're building that, should be part of the discussion. But I think for what they're thinking about now is first it's like, it's so hard to get there, let's figure that out.
One key difference is there are no native peoples in any of these places they're going to colonize.
That we know of.
That we know of yet. All right, let's go over here.
So I have a question about these four particular individuals. You mentioned that they had an early fascination with space and they saw an industry that they could disrupt. I'm wondering, how do they view problems on the Earth itself, which are really big challenges like climate change? And I'm just curious to know what all four of them think about that.
Well, and you hear that a lot in space, right? Why should we go to space on all these problems here on Earth? I'll try to summarize that or answer your question through Jeff Bezos' eyes, because I think he ties those two together a lot. His idea is to go to space to preserve the Earth, right? This whole notion that we were talking about where Earth is zoned, residential and preserved as a national park. It's got limited resources, where in space, for example, just the solar energy, there's no, the atmosphere, no day and night. You could do that. There are, all kinds of resources on asteroids and other celestial bodies that you can, bring back. And that, he says, Plan B should be to make sure that Plan A, Earth, works, and that we're able to evolve here. And while, going to space is, kind of romanticized and really cool, and Mars would be cool, as Jeff would say, it's really hard, and that Mars, for example, would make Antarctica look like a paradise. And, just think about Earth and palm trees and waterfalls and whiskey and all the great things that we just love to have on Earth that you don't have in space. At least not yet. So, I think that's at least how he would answer that. Richard Branson and Paul Allen and actually Elon Musk think about putting up constellations of satellites that would have a lot of benefits for people on Earth that really could monitor the health of the planet. Could look at crop yields, erosion, flooding, can really give you a sense of a whole look at what's going on Earth and a whole new data set that we don't necessarily have now. So I think that's another way in which they would connect the two.
All right, let's go up here in the front.
Yeah, thank you. I come from a Soviet country, and former Soviet country, and in Soviet literature, sci-fi literature, and popular culture in 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was this common narrative that going to space, would assume interspecies interaction. In other words, humans would meet aliens. Like in recent years, in popular culture and in media, and we often see the narrative that Earth is being polluted, contaminated, and there's a scarcity of resources, and that's why we have to look for, new places in the universe. I was just wondering, I'm curious, having interacted with and spoken to these billionaires, aside from business motives, could you please tell us what drives their desire and curiosity to actually go beyond Earth and explore cosmos and other planets? Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's the business aspect of it that you mentioned, but I do think there is a real genuine this is a great adventure, right? Going to space. I mean, what's a bigger adventure than that? And it's really hard and it's risky, but going to space could have enormous benefits. And there's this thought too, I think, that if you can go to space more routinely and efficiently, and it's more accessible, then that opens up all sorts of opportunities that we can't even sort of imagine right now. And a lot of they talk about this they compare it to the internet. Sort of the early days of the internet that we didn't, I don't think we could foresee all of the things that we now rely on the internet to do. And they see space as sort of comparable to that once you can go, if you have that transportation infrastructure, it could open up all sorts of possibilities.
Let's go at the back here.
What sort of potential future regulatory constraints are these entrepreneurs most concerned about?
Right. So this came up earlier when you talked to about space tourism, for example. What governs it? It's sort of regulated, kind of like skydiving. Right? It's an informed consent standard. You want to jump out of a plane? Okay, you could die. You have to acknowledge that you could die, but if you sign there, you can go. These licenses are governed. You have to, sort of protect, people and property on the ground. But I think the industry has been successful so far of, keeping, fairly free rein to be able to develop, their vehicles as they see fit and to go out and to experiment. And they would argue that if the regulations are too tight, then they wouldn't be able to do that, and the industry isn't able to advance. And they need a freedom to be able to go out and explore and experiment and to fail.
Are these companies, do you see them actively trying to shape those regulations, or are they just trying to stiff arm it and just prevent as much as they can?
They certainly were early on. I mean, there were some, in around after the Ansari X Prize, all of a sudden Congress woke up to this. And I talk a little bit about this in the book, and there were some, in Congress who were saying, the FAA, has this sort of tombstone mentality that we'll regulate once, we start putting people in the ground. And the industry sort of, really kind of pushed hard against that and said if the regulations are too burdensome, then that'll just, it'll just stifle the industry and we won't be able to take off.
Yeah. All right, let's go back up here.
Thanks. Hi. Rumsfeld Foundation Program Sarhan from Azerbaijan. I'd like to know how you came to the idea to write a book on this topic, and in working with these people, how you would describe them, especially Jeff and Elon, with one word, except charisma.
I'll start with the book first. So here's the thing. I was born in 1973, after Apollo, really. My first memory of space that stuck with me was in 1986 with the Challenger explosion. I was actually home sick from school that day and was watching maybe a game show on TV, and suddenly they interrupted that with the news to see it. And I didn't grow up thinking about space, frankly, and didn't cover it really as a journalist for a lot of my career. I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson who said of the shuttle program in low Earth orbit, we're boldly going where many have already gone before. And it just didn't captivate my interest. And even if you look back at the Apollo era, I mean, that was, hugely successful and hugely popular, but funding for NASA started decreasing, before 1969, before people started going on to the moon. And ultimately, they ended the Apollo program, and people blame Richard Nixon for this, but there are polls that show that the American public was already losing interest in the moon. What's happening now, and why I wanted to write the book, is I'm interested in space. I think a lot of people are interested in space again, because there's so much going on. It's just it's, as a reporter, there's it's a great story. It's just, there's so much news, and, it's, in some ways, it's really optimistic, right? What they're trying to achieve that we don't always get, particularly here in Washington. And it's hard, and it's challenging, and it's risky, and it's dangerous. And you're seeing, I think, a real seminal moment that I wanted to just capture in the book. And in some ways, it's only just beginning, and who knows where the story is going to go. And that was sort of one of the concerns in writing the book, where does it end? Right? So it ends sort of with this, doesn't end, I'm not going to give away, but it ends with sort of an idea, right, that we're, going out there. And I'm not going to duck your other question because I hate it. I'm a journalist. I hate it when people do that. Why don't I say this for Elon and Jeff? With one word description, that's what you wanted. I think you can both call them smart. I think that's accurate and keeps me out of trouble.
All right, let's go back here in the back.
Hey, Chris, congratulations on the book. My question is, we have a new NASA administrator on the horizon here. With what you've learned about the commercial space industry, what's your advice to the next NASA administrator with regard to their dealing with commercial space?
I mean, as a journalist and a chronicler, I try not to give advice. I think what we've seen from the people who are giving advice, and now that the Trump administration has reconstituted the National Space Council, and you're seeing Vice President Pence, who's shown a real interest in space, and Scott Pace, the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council, I think there is a real mandate for NASA to work with private industry and with international partners. I mean, you've seen the vice president talk about that's sort of key areas. And I think they want to leverage, the advancements that these companies have made. If we're going to go to the moon and have not just to plant a flag and to walk around and leave footprints and come back, but to have a permanent presence on the moon the way we do on the International Space Station, given how hard that is, it kind of takes everyone, and it just can't be NASA alone or the United States alone. I mean, we saw that with the International Space Station, right? Sort of the key word there is international. But now if you pull in, a Jeff Bezos and an Elon Musk and a Richard Branson and a Paul Allen, and now this industry, right, that's beginning to grow up around them. I mean, we pay a lot of attention to them. They're the billionaires, and they get all the attention, and they've got the rockets, and they're the launch providers. But let's not forget about, companies like Bigelow Aerospace that are, building habitats, right, for space, or Made in Space that wants to do manufacturing in space, so you don't have to put it up there. I think that's where the Obama or the Trump administration, is moving. But I'll let the NASA administrator decide that.
All right, so we're almost out of time here. I got time for one last question. This gentleman back here has had his hand up.
Yeah, hi. Tory Bruno and ULA are also innovating in space and launch. Do you see them as fundamentally different from these billionaires, or how do they fit into the overall ecosystem of space innovation? Thanks.
Yeah, well, the United Launch Alliance is really under Tory has transformed, and they had been existing almost exclusively on government contracts. So that's sort of one of the key differences, that the government was most of their revenue. And then when you see SpaceX come in, and the former CEO was pushed out, and they brought in Tory Bruno, and Tory Bruno was very clear, and he said he was brought in, as he said, quote, to literally transform the company so that it could compete against SpaceX. So they've had to innovate, and they're building a new rocket, the Vulcan rocket, which would have a reusable engine. They're not going to land the booster, but they still want to reuse the engine. Their costs have come down so that they can compete, and this is Lockheed Martin and Boeing, right? These guys have been around. They're tremendously successful companies that have done amazing things, not just in space, but in defense, and that have a lot of talent and a lot of resources and can innovate as well. And now they're going to be pushed not just by SpaceX, but if Blue Origin gets into the national security launch market, they're going to face more competition, and that only force them to be more competitive.
All right. So I want to thank you. Our time is up here, but I know you'll be available out in the back. I think we have books out there. So if people want to buy a book and get an autograph, we have Chris here with us today. So please join me in thanking Chris for this great discussion. Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you. All right.